Tonight, we trace what that stone witnessed. The emperors who shaped Rome and were shaped by her. The power that transformed men and was transformed by them. There is a weight that certain offices carry, a burden that transforms whoever assumes it, that demands everything and offers in return only the terrible privilege of being remembered. The Roman emperors bore this weight for 5 centuries, from Augustus's quiet revolution to the final flickering of Western authority. And in bearing it, they became something more than men, yet somehow less than what they might have been had power never found them. Tonight, we trace the most powerful among them, not as political history, but as meditation, as contemplation of what power accomplishes and what it cannot touch, of the mystery that made these men simultaneously masters of the world and prisoners of their own supremacy. The night is long, and the story we follow stretches across half a millennium. We need not hurry. The emperors we examine have long since passed into the silence that awaits all authority. Their triumphs and failures are equally complete. Their consequences continue to unfold in ways we can observe, without the urgency that subjects once felt. The word emperor itself tells a story. It derives from imperator, a title Roman generals received from their troops after victory, a recognition of military achievement that carried no permanent authority. Augustus transformed this battlefield honor into something permanent, something that passed from one man to another through adoption, assassination, civil war, or occasionally peaceful succession. The transformation was itself revolutionary. The creation of monarchy in a culture that had expelled its kings 5 centuries earlier. The concentration of power in hands that carefully avoided the appearance of concentration. We begin with Augustus himself, the careful revolutionary who ended the Republic while claiming to restore it, who accumulated powers so gradually that Romans barely noticed their freedom slipping away until it had entirely vanished. His transformation from Octavian, the avenging heir, to Augustus, the father of his country, established patterns that every successor would follow or deliberately violate, established the template against which all subsequent emperors would be measured. We trace the Julio-Claudians who inherited his system, Tiberius who never wanted power and withdrew from it to an island's isolation, Claudius whom everyone underestimated until he proved himself capable, Nero whose artistic ambitions collided catastrophically with imperial requirements. We witness the year of 4 emperors, when the system nearly collapsed, when civil war revealed that emperors could be made elsewhere than Rome, when the secret of empire was disclosed that legions, rather than senate, held the true power of selection. We follow the Flavians, who restored stability through competence rather than bloodline, who built the Colosseum on the grounds of Nero's excess, who proved that new dynasties could establish themselves through achievement when ancient lineages failed. We stand with Trajan at the empire's greatest extent, watching Roman eagles planted on shores of the Persian Gulf, contemplating whether expansion strengthened or ultimately weakened what Augustus had built. We walk Hadrian's Wall across Britain's hills, feeling the cold wind that marked Rome's chosen boundary, understanding that the decision not to conquer further was itself an exercise of supreme power. We sit with Marcus Aurelius in his campaign tent, reading philosophy by lamplight while barbarian armies gathered in the darkness beyond, learning that wisdom offers no exemption from duty's weight. We witness Diocletian's desperate genius, the division of empire that acknowledged what unity could no longer achieve, the administrative revolution that preserved Rome by transforming her beyond recognition. We stand at the Milvian Bridge with Constantine, watching a vision that would redirect the religious course of Western civilization, contemplating the mystery of whether faith drove his conversion or calculation, and whether such distinctions matter when consequences prove so vast. We follow Julian's doomed attempt to restore the old gods, to prove that Rome's ancient covenant with Jupiter and Mars might be renewed. And we witness that covenant's final failure, the permanent triumph of the Galilean over all the deities Rome had accumulated across 1,000 years of expansion. We end with Justinian in Constantinople, dreaming of restoration when Rome herself had fallen, building churches whose domes still astonish, codifying laws that still shape how we think about justice. The last emperor who genuinely believed the Roman world might be reunited, whose ambitions exceeded what his century could sustain. This chronicle does not seek to rank or judge, does not attempt to determine which emperors were good and which were wicked. Such categories dissolve under patient examination. The tyrants often proved effective, the philosophers often failed. The competent often gave way to the catastrophic through no fault except mortality. We seek instead to witness, to understand as fully as understanding permits, to sit with the complexity that made Roman imperial power simultaneously magnificent and terrible, creative and destructive. A force that built civilization and consumed those who wielded it. As sleep approaches, as the mind grows quiet and receptive, we offer these meditations on power and its prices as companions for the journey toward rest. The emperors we trace are history now, are completed reigns whose outcomes we know, whose legacies we inhabit. We can examine them safely, can learn from them what they have to teach, can carry their lessons into whatever dreams await us in the hours ahead. The laurel wreath that emperors wore carried meanings older than Rome, symbolized victory, achievement, divine favor. The recognition that some among us rise above the common measure. The men who wore it found that the crown's weight never lessened, that power's demands only increased with power's expansion, that the loneliness at empire's apex exceeded what anyone who had not stood there could imagine. Let the night deepen. Let the silence settle. Let the ancient voices speak across the vast distances that separate us from them. The emperors of Rome await. Let us enter their light and shadow. In the blood-slicked chamber where Julius Caesar fell beneath senatorial daggers, a transformation began that would reshape the world more completely than any conquest the Republic had achieved. The dictator lay dead among the statues of kings Rome had expelled 5 centuries earlier, and somewhere across the city, a young man of 19 learned that he had been named heir to the most dangerous inheritance history had yet produced. It is said that those who advised Octavian counseled caution, that he should refuse the adoption, decline the legacy, let older and more experienced men contest for Caesar's mantle. The young man listened to their wisdom and rejected it entirely. He understood something his advisers did not, that in Rome's transformed politics, hesitation meant death, that the name of Caesar carried power that no caution could provide, that his great-uncle had left him not merely money and status, but an army's loyalty and a populace's love. This is where our journey begins, not with established power, but with its acquisition, with the patient decades through which a sickly youth transformed himself into Augustus, the first among equals, who was in truth alone above all others. 2. The deepening mystery whispers tell us of the years that followed, the proscriptions that funded civil war, the alliance with Antony that divided the Roman world, the final confrontation at Actium, where the future of civilization turned on a naval battle in Greek waters. Octavian was not a natural military commander. He was seasick during the battle that decided everything, left the actual fighting to Agrippa, while he struggled to remain upright on a rolling deck. Yet he won. He always won, not through personal prowess, but through the patient accumulation of advantages that made victory inevitable before battle was ever joined. The transformation of republic into principate unfolded with such careful gradualism that contemporaries could argue about whether it had happened at all. Augustus never claimed to be king. The word itself remained poison in Roman political discourse. He was instead princeps, first citizen, a position that technically existed within republican tradition. He held powers that previous Romans had held, the tribunician authority that made his person sacrosanct, the proconsular command that gave him control of the provinces where legions were stationed, the religious offices that made him Pontifex Maximus, bridge builder between Romans and their gods. What made his position revolutionary was not any single power, but their combination, their concentration in one man permanently, rather than distributed among many temporarily. The Senate continued to meet, continued to debate, continued to issue decrees. But the Senate understood that its function had changed, that it now advised rather than decided, that the quiet man in the simple toga who sat among them without apparent precedence was in truth the only voice that mattered. The building program that transformed Rome from brick to marble was itself political statement. The Forum of Augustus, the Temple of Mars Ultor, the restoration of 82 temples that republican neglect had allowed to decay. Augustus presented himself as restorer rather than revolutionary, as the man who had rescued Roman tradition from those who would have destroyed it. The irony that he had destroyed the Republic while claiming to restore it was apparent to those who cared to see. But those who pointed this out too clearly found their careers mysteriously stalled, their influence quietly diminished, their voices gradually excluded from circles that mattered. The succession problem haunted his entire reign. Augustus outlived his chosen heirs with consistency that seemed almost cursed. Marcellus, his nephew, dead at 19. Gaius and Lucius, his adopted grandsons, dead in their 20s. Agrippa, his general and son-in-law, dead before any of them. In the end, only Tiberius remained, his stepson, never his first choice, the man who would receive the inheritance only because everyone Augustus preferred had preceded him to the grave. Some believe that Augustus's genius lay in understanding what Rome actually needed. Stability rather than liberty, prosperity rather than glory, the quiet accumulation of wealth and security rather than the dramatic conquests that had enriched generals while impoverishing the state. The Pax Romana that his reign inaugurated would endure for 2 centuries, would create conditions in which trade flourished, and cities grew and cultures mingled across an empire united by roads and laws, and the certainty that Roman peace was maintained by Roman swords. Others see in his achievement something darker, the death of freedom so gradual that those who lost it barely noticed, the transformation of citizens into subjects who retained the forms of self-governance while losing its substance entirely, the liberty that Romans had defended for 5 centuries, that they had died to protect against kings both foreign and domestic, was traded for security so complete that few questioned whether the exchange had been wise. 3. The fade into silence, and now, as sleep approaches, and the mind grows receptive to mysteries that daylight cannot hold, we contemplate the final hours of the man who had remade the world. Augustus died at Nola in August of 14 CE, in the same room where his father had died decades before. He had reigned for 41 years, longer than most Romans lived in that age. Long enough that few could remember what the Republic had actually been like. Long enough that the system he had created seemed not innovation, but eternal fact. His final words are variously reported. Some say he asked Livia, his wife of 50 years, to remember their marriage and live well. Some say he asked those attending him whether he had played his part well in the comedy of life, and when they agreed he had, requested applause as for an actor leaving the stage. The uncertainty itself seems appropriate. The man who had carefully crafted his public image left even his death open to interpretation. The deification that followed his funeral was not mere flattery, but logical conclusion. If the emperors who followed him ruled as his successors, then he must have been something more than mortal, must have ascended to join Jupiter and Mars among the gods who protected Rome. The temples that rose in his honor across the empire proclaimed what his careful modesty had always denied, that he had been divine all along, that his authority derived not merely from accumulated offices, but from sacred nature that death had merely revealed. Let the silence settle now over the forum he built, over the mausoleum where his ashes were placed, over the empire he created and could not take with him into whatever awaited beyond mortality's boundary. Augustus had solved the problem of Roman government, had created a system stable enough to survive his death, flexible enough to accommodate successors of varying capability, enduring enough to outlast centuries of challenge. But he had also created a problem that would haunt every successor: how to follow the unfollowable, how to wear a laurel wreath that had been shaped to fit only one head, how to exercise power that had been designed for a specific genius and must now be adapted to ordinary men. The first emperor passed into divinity. The empire he created remained behind, waiting for those who would inherit it, challenge it, preserve it, and ultimately lose it across centuries yet to unfold. And somewhere in the silence between what Augustus built and what his successors would make of it, the mystery of Rome's transformation from republic to empire remains. Completed yet somehow never complete, understood yet ultimately inexplicable, the work of one man who changed everything while seeming to change nothing at all. Tiberius never wanted to be emperor, and when the weight of purple finally descended upon his reluctant shoulders, he carried it with a resentment that darkened into paranoia, that eventually drove him from Rome itself to an island fortress, where he would rule through letters what he could no longer bear to see. It is said that he had begged Augustus to let him retire, had withdrawn to Rhodes for 7 years in what may have been exile, or may have been escape from a court whose intrigues exhausted him. When Augustus's preferred heirs died one by one, Tiberius understood that fate or providence was forcing upon him a role he had spent his life avoiding. The purple came to him not as prize, but as prison sentence, not as reward, but as duty from which no honorable Roman could flee. This is where our contemplation continues, with an emperor who demonstrated that supreme power need not be desired to be effectively wielded, that competence can coexist with misery, that Rome could be governed by a man who found the governing itself a torment. 2. The deepening mystery. Whispers tell us of the reign that followed. 23 years of capable administration overshadowed by a reputation for cruelty that may have been earned or may have been constructed by those who survived him. The provinces were well governed under Tiberius. The treasury accumulated reserves that his successors would squander. The borders remained secure through military skill that Tiberius had demonstrated long before the crown confined him to civilian command. Yet something was wrong from the beginning. The Senate that Augustus had carefully cultivated found itself facing an emperor who despised its civility while demanding it, who invited genuine debate while punishing those who offered it, who withdrew into silences that terrified men who needed to know their master's will. The treason trials that multiplied through his reign created an atmosphere of suspicion that corroded everything the Augustan settlement had built. The delicate balance between imperial authority and senatorial dignity. The polite fiction that the Republic somehow continued under monarchical guidance. Sejanus rose in this atmosphere of fear. The Praetorian prefect who consolidated the emperor's guard into a single camp, who made himself indispensable to a ruler who increasingly wished to be dispensed from ruling itself. For years Sejanus seemed the true power behind the throne, the man through whom access to the emperor must be negotiated, the favorite whose influence exceeded what any subject should possess. Then, suddenly, he fell. Arrested in the Senate he had dominated, executed along with his family, his followers purged in a terror that revealed how precarious Orbio was beneath Tiberius's suspicious gaze. The withdrawal to Capri in 26 CE marked something unprecedented. An emperor who ruled the world from an island he refused to leave, who never entered Rome again in the 11 years that remained to him, who governed through correspondence, what he could no longer tolerate governing in person. The villas he built on Capri's cliffs still mark the island's heights, their ruins testifying to the scale of his self-imposed exile, to the determination with which he separated himself from the capital of the world he ruled. What drove him to that island? Some ancient sources speak of depravity, of cruelties and perversions practiced far from witnesses who might have constrained them. Others suggest exhaustion, the weariness of a man who had never wanted command finally finding a way to exercise it without enduring its ceremonies, its pretensions, its endless demands for the imperial presence. Perhaps both explanations hold partial truth. Perhaps the island offered both escape and license, both relief from duty's visible performance and freedom to indulge whatever darkness long suppression had accumulated. The letters that flowed from Capri to Rome maintained imperial governance with efficiency that the emperor's absence might have threatened. Decisions were made, appointments confirmed, borders defended, treasury managed. The machinery of empire that Augustus had constructed proved capable of operating without the emperor's physical presence, proved that Rome had become system rather than merely ruler, that administration had developed its own momentum that no individual's withdrawal could halt. Yet something essential was lost. The Senate that received Tiberius's letters could not read his face, could not judge his mood, could not calibrate their civility to his actual wishes. The uncertainty bred more fear than his presence ever had. Men were condemned for words that might have been forgiven had they been spoken in his hearing, for gestures that might have amused rather than offended had he witnessed them directly. The distance that Tiberius had sought for his own relief became torture for those who remained behind, waiting for judgments from an authority they could no longer see through. The fade into silence. And now, as the night deepens and contemplation grows quiet, we find ourselves on Capri's heights, looking across the bay toward a Rome that Tiberius had abandoned forever. The villa of Jovis still shows its foundations, the complex from which an empire was directed, the chambers where Tiberius spent his final decade, the gardens where he walked above seas that separated him from responsibilities he could not escape by any distance. The winds that blow across those ruins carried his letters southward, carried death sentences and administrative decrees, carried the will of a man who had learned that being emperor meant being alone regardless of how many attendants surrounded you. He died in 37 C at Misenum, perhaps smothered by those who had grown impatient waiting for nature to release them from his rule. Caligula, his great-nephew, his heir, the young man who had lived with him on Capri during the exile years, received the news and the power simultaneously. The Senate that had lived in fear of Tiberius's letters rejoiced at his death with frankness that revealed how complete their alienation had become. No defecation followed. The man who had been Augustus's chosen successor, who had served the first emperor loyally for decades, who had governed competently, if not lovingly, for 23 years, passed from mortality without the divine honors that had elevated his predecessor. The Senate that had trembled at his name declined to place him among the gods. The memory that remained was not of achievements but of fears, not of province well governed, but of trials that had destroyed the innocent alongside the guilty. Let the silence settle now over Capri, over the bay that Tiberius watched through all those isolated years, over the ruins that mark where absolute power retreated from its own capital. The Shadow Emperor had demonstrated something that his successors would confirm again and again, that the purple offered no happiness, that supreme authority brought supreme loneliness, that the distance between the throne and all other positions was too vast for any human connection to cross. The island keeps its secret still. The winds that carried imperial letters have long since scattered. And somewhere in the mystery of why a man who ruled the world chose to rule it from exile, something true about power reveals itself. Its capacity to isolate, its tendency to transform connection into suspicion, its ultimate inability to provide what the heart requires regardless of what it offers the ambition. Behind a curtain, in the chaos following assassination, trembling in terror while soldiers searched for anyone connected to the fallen emperor, Claudius waited. The fool of the Claudian house, the stammerer whom no one had ever considered dangerous, the scholar hidden from power by disabilities that his family found embarrassing. It is said that the Praetorian Guard discovered him by accident, that his feet protruded from beneath the curtain where he had concealed himself, that he was dragged forth expecting death and found instead a throne. The soldiers who had murdered Caligula needed an emperor to legitimize their action, needed someone from the divine family of Augustus to confirm that they served the state rather than merely their own interests. Claudius was the only adult male of that bloodline who remained alive. His survival had been his qualification. This is where our contemplation continues. With an emperor who proved that underestimation can be its own protection, that the decades spent in obscurity had been education rather than merely exile, that the fool whom everyone dismissed had been watching, learning, understanding what power required, while those who possessed it assumed he comprehended nothing. 2. The deepening mystery whispers. Tell us of the transformation that followed his unlikely elevation, the stammering scholar becoming decisive administrator, the invalid whom Augustus had kept from public view, becoming conqueror of Britain, the joke of the imperial family becoming builder, descender, lawgiver, reformer, whose reign would be remembered as effective despite its irregular beginning. The conquest of Britain in 43 CE announced that Claudius intended to be taken seriously. The island that Julius Caesar had touched and abandoned, that Augustus had considered and declined, that no subsequent emperor had attempted. This became Claudius's project. His demonstration that military glory could belong even to an emperor who could not himself command armies in the field. He travelled to Britain to receive the surrender of Camulodunum, spent 16 days on the island that would remain Roman for 3.5 centuries, returned to a triumph that established his legitimacy more firmly than any act of Senate confirmation could have achieved. The administrative innovations that characterized his reign revealed what the years of apparent uselessness had actually produced. Claudius had studied, had read histories, had examined documents, had developed understanding of how Rome actually functioned that those destined for power had never bothered to acquire. The freedmen whom he elevated to positions of influence scandalized the aristocracy, but they also created a professional bureaucracy that could manage an empire's complexity more effectively than amateur senators, whose attention was divided among too many obligations. The harbour at Ostia that Claudius ordered, constructed, solved a problem that had limited Rome for centuries. The inability of the largest ships to navigate the Tiber. The necessity of transferring grain to smaller vessels before it could reach the capital. The new harbour allowed direct unloading, secured the food supply that kept Rome's population from the famine that was always one bad harvest away. Demonstrated that infrastructure could be as glorious as conquest when properly understood. The legal reforms that occupied so much of his attention revealed a mind that cared about justice in its particulars, rather than merely its proclamations. Claudius heard cases personally, rendered judgments that contemporaries sometimes found eccentric, but that often displayed genuine concern for equity. The extension of citizenship to Gallic nobles that he championed against senatorial opposition showed understanding that Rome's greatness lay in incorporation rather than exclusion, that the empire endured because it made Romans of those it conquered rather than merely subjects. Yet, the vulnerabilities that had marked him before elevation never entirely disappeared. The wives he married, Messalina, whose alleged debaucheries scandalized Rome until her execution, Agrippina, whose ambitions for her son Nero led ultimately to Claudius's own death, manipulated him in ways that suggested the old uncertainties persisted beneath the imperial competence. The freedmen whose abilities he recognized also accumulated influence that made them powers unto themselves, that created resentments among aristocrats who found themselves petitioning former slaves for access to the emperor. Some believe that Claudius's reign demonstrated how much the empire had become system rather than merely personal rule. That even an emperor, whom no one had chosen deliberately, whom no one had trained for power, whom no one had expected to succeed, could govern effectively because the machinery of governance had developed its own momentum. Others see in his achievements evidence of genuine individual capability, intelligence that had been overlooked rather than absent, abilities that had been denied opportunity rather than development. 3. The fade into silence. And now, as contemplation grows quiet, we find ourselves in the palace where Claudius took his final meal, poisoned, perhaps, by mushrooms that Agrippina had prepared, cleared from the path so that her son might inherit what she had married to obtain. The death in 54 CE was convenient enough to inspire suspicion that has never been resolved. Claudius was 63, had been unwell for years, might have died naturally at any moment, but the timing served Agrippina's purposes so perfectly, and her reputation for ruthlessness was so established that few contemporaries or historians since have accepted that mere chance removed the obstacle to Nero's succession. The deification that followed his death was genuine, but also ironic. The stammering fool whom his own family had hidden from public view, now elevated to divine status, worshipped in temples across the empire, invoked as God by those who had mocked him as imbecile. The transformation was complete. The man whom no one had wanted as emperor was now honored as if he had been destined for divinity all along. Let the silence settle now over the libraries, where Claudius spent his studious years, over the harbour he built that fed Rome for centuries, over the grave where his ashes rested before being scattered when his memory was eventually attacked. The stammerer had silenced doubt through achievement that no disability could diminish, had demonstrated that the qualities which make emperors effective are not the qualities which make them expected. The fool had proven wise. The invalid had proven capable. And somewhere in the space between what Claudius appeared to be and what he actually was, a truth about human judgment reveals itself. Our tendency to mistake surface for substance. Our habit of dismissing what we have not troubled to examine. Our surprise when those we underestimated prove greater than those we exalted. Nero sang while Rome burned, or so the legend insists. But the truth, as always, is more complicated than the stories we tell about power's corruptions. The emperor who became synonymous with tyranny began his reign as hope itself, guided by Seneca the philosopher and Burrus the general, a golden youth whom the empire welcomed as relief from Claudius's elderly uncertainties. It is said that when asked to sign his first death warrant, the young Nero wept, lamenting the necessity of literacy that required him to authorize what he could not bear to command. The sensitivity that this story suggests, genuine or performed, it matters little, characterized the early years of a reign that would end in flames and suicide, that would transform hope into horror so completely that Nero's name became synonym for everything imperial power should not be. This is where our contemplation continues, with an emperor who embodied both the possibilities and the dangers of absolute authority, whose artistic ambitions collided with political requirements, whose reign illuminated what happened when someone who wanted to be artist was forced instead to be emperor. Titu, the deepening mystery, whispers, tell us of the golden years that began the reign, the quinquennium Neronis that later emperors would cite as model of good governance, the 5 years during which Seneca's influence shaped policy and Burrus's discipline constrained excess. The Senate recovered some of the dignity that Claudius's freedmen had diminished. The provinces were administered with competence that their governor's autonomy allowed. The treasury remained solvent, the border secure, the empire at peace with itself, if not with its neighbors. The death of Agrippina in 59 CE marked something's ending. Matricide, however, justified by claims of her conspiracies against him, severed Nero from the constraints that maternal presence had provided. Seneca's influence waned thereafter. Burrus died, and the emperor who emerged from their tutelage proved to be someone quite different from the student they had shaped. The artist who had hidden behind the philosopher's council now demanded recognition that Roman tradition could not provide without scandal. The performances began. Nero competing in musical contests, singing and playing the lyre before audiences who were forbidden to leave regardless of how long the imperial recitals continued. The Greeks whom he visited during his tour of 667 CE understood the honor he believed he was offering them. The Romans he had left behind understood only the disgrace of an emperor who had forgotten what emperors were supposed to be. The 500 crowns he won in Greece, awarded by judges who understood what their own survival required, proclaimed artistic achievement that his subjects back home could only interpret as degradation. The Great Fire of 64 CE transformed Rome more thoroughly than any imperial building program had managed. The flames that consumed 10 of the city's 14 districts were catastrophe beyond any the capital had known. Yet they were also opportunity. The destruction of the cramped and crumbling tenements that had made Rome dangerous and dark, giving way to the city Nero envisioned. Broader streets, regulated building heights, the Golden House whose scale exceeded anything an emperor had dared before. The Golden House became symbol of everything the fire had revealed about Nero's priorities. While homeless Romans crowded into whatever shelter they could find, the emperor was constructing a pleasure palace that sprawled across lands the fire had conveniently cleared. The artificial lake, the rotating dining room, the entrance hall large enough for a colossus of the emperor himself. All proclaimed that Nero had found in disaster the opportunity to build the monument to himself that peace would never have permitted. The Christians whom Nero blamed for the fire, wrapped in animal skins to be torn by dogs, crucified, and set alight to illuminate his gardens, provided scapegoats convenient enough that suspicion has never ceased regarding who actually started the flames. Whether Nero ordered the fire, exploited the fire, or merely failed to mourn the fire with appropriate sincerity has been debated for 2 millennia. What is certain is that he benefited from it. That the city which rose from the ashes was more magnificent than what had burned, that the Golden House required precisely the space the fire had provided. The conspiracy of Piso in 65 CE revealed how fragile Nero's position had become. Senators, knights, officers, even his former tutor Seneca, drawn into a plot whose discovery unleashed executions that decimated the aristocracy. The terror that followed consumed not merely conspirators, but anyone whose prominence or wealth attracted imperial attention, whose elimination might serve the treasury's needs or the emperor's fears. The reign that had begun with reluctance to sign death warrants ended with executions so numerous that the names have blurred together. Threed. The fade into silence. And now, as the night deepens, we trace the final hours of an emperor who had wanted to be remembered for his art. The end came in 68 CE, when the legions that had endured Nero's neglect finally rose against him. First in Gaul, then in Spain, then the Praetorian Guard itself in Rome. The emperor who had performed before thousands found himself suddenly alone, abandoned by gods who had calculated that their futures lay with his successors, deserted by freedmen who had flattered him while his power remained, left with only a handful of companions as he fled a city that no longer wanted him. The final night was spent in a freedman's villa outside Rome, waiting for horsemen who would drag him back for the execution the Senate had decreed. Unable to take his own life, the hands that had played the lyre so beautifully could not drive the dagger home. He required a companion's assistance for the final stroke. What an artist dies in me, he supposedly lamented, believing even in death that his true identity had been the artist that emperorship had prevented him from becoming. No deification followed. The Senate damned his memory instead, ordered his images destroyed, his name erased, his reign forgotten. The Golden House was buried beneath the baths that Trajan would later build, its rooms filled with rubble, its frescoes hidden from light for centuries, until Renaissance excavators accidentally discovered them. The artist whom Nero believed himself to be was rejected by the audience he had tried to impress. The emperor whom duty had required him to be had failed too completely for any rehabilitation. Let the silence settle now over the remains of the Golden House, over the Colosseum that rose on the site of Nero's artificial lake, over the memory of an emperor who illustrated what happens when self-conception and obligation diverge too completely. The fire had burned both ways, had consumed Rome and had consumed Nero himself, had transformed the city while revealing the man, had created opportunity and tragedy in equal measure. The artist died believing himself unappreciated. The emperor died despised. And somewhere in the space between who Nero wanted to be and who Rome required him to be, a truth about power reveals itself. Its demands that cannot be negotiated. Its requirements that consume those who would redirect them. Its indifference to the desires of those who wield it. In the chaos of the year of 4 emperors, when Galba, Otho, and Vitellius rose and fell in rapid succession, when Rome tore itself apart, discovering that emperors could be made elsewhere than in the capital, a general in the east watched and waited. Vespasian was no aristocrat, claimed no divine bloodline, descended from tax collectors and mule drivers rather than the ancient families who had always assumed power belonged to them by right. It is said that omens had marked him for greatness. A stray dog had once brought a human hand to his dining table. An ox had broken into his room and knelt before him. A cypress tree had fallen and risen again on his family's land. Whether these stories were invented after his rise or genuinely preceded it, they served to legitimize what bloodline could not. The elevation of a man whose ancestors had never imagined their descendant might rule the world. This is where our contemplation continues, with an emperor who demonstrated that Rome could be saved by competence when heritage had failed, that the system Augustus had built could survive even the violent disputes over who should operate it. 2. The deepening mystery Vespers tell us of the path that brought Vespasian to the purple, the military commands that had earned him reputation, the Jewish revolt that had placed legions under his control at the moment when legions determined everything, the careful calculation that delayed his bid until rivals had exhausted themselves and the empire was ready for stability rather than more conflict. The victory at Cremona in 69 CE broke Vitellius's power, but the sack that followed shamed the legions that accomplished it. Roman soldiers destroying a Roman city with thoroughness that enemies had rarely managed. The message was clear. The civil wars had released forces that could destroy what they were supposedly fighting to control. Vespasian understood that his first task was not merely to win, but to end the winning, to restore the discipline that months of chaos had corroded, to make the legions again instruments of the state rather than makers of emperors. The treasury that Nero and the civil wars had emptied required replenishment that could not wait for normal revenues to accumulate. Vespasian's economies became legendary. His willingness to reduce expenditures that predecessors had considered essential, his attention to sources of income that aristocratic emperors had found beneath their dignity, the tax on urine, collected from public toilets for use in tanning, provoked his son Titus's disgust. Vespasian responded by holding a coin under Titus's nose and asking whether it smelled. Money, he observed, had no odor regardless of its source. The rebuilding of the Capitol, the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus that had burned during the street fighting that accompanied Vitellius's fall, announced that Rome would be restored rather than merely stabilized. Vespasian himself carried the first basket of rubble from the ruined site, demonstrated by personal labor that the work of reconstruction was sacred obligation rather than mere construction project. The Rome that civil war had damaged would rise again, would be greater than before, would prove that the crisis had been interruption rather than ending. The Colosseum's construction began during Vespasian's reign, not yet called by that name, which would come later from the colossal statue nearby, but planned from the beginning as monument to the new dynasty's values. Where Nero had built private pleasure palace, the Flavians would build public entertainment venue. Where the Golden House had proclaimed one man's greatness, the amphitheater would proclaim the restored relationship between emperor and people. The contrast was deliberate. Was political statement made in stone, was announcement that a different kind of emperor had arrived. The succession that Vespasian arranged solved the problem that had created the year of chaos. The absence of clear air when Nero fell. The vacuum into which ambitious generals had rushed. Titus, his elder son, was associated in power during Vespasian's lifetime, was granted tribunician authority and proconsular command, was made unmistakably clear as designated successor. Domitian, the younger son, received lesser honors, but enough to indicate that the dynasty had depth, that the death of one heir would not leave succession again to civil war's arbitration. The humor that characterized Vespasian's rule softened what might otherwise have seemed merely vulgar efficiency. His jokes at his own expense, his awareness that mule drivers' descendants were not supposed to become emperors, disarmed critics who might have attacked his origins. When death approached, he rose from his bed, insisting that an emperor should die on his feet. Feeling the final moments come, he observed that he must be becoming a god. The wit undercut the pretension that surrounded imperial dignity, reminded Rome that the purple was worn by a human being who understood his own absurdity. Threed, the fade into silence. And now, as contemplation grows quiet, we find ourselves at the modest origins from which Vespasian rose, the Italian town of Reat, where his family had been respectable but never prominent, where nothing in his early circumstances predicted the heights he would achieve. He died in 79 CE at his family's estate near Reat. Having reigned for 10 years, having transformed an empire that civil war had seemed about to destroy into something stable enough to endure for centuries more. The deification that followed was earned rather than merely conventional. The Senate that granted it recognized genuine achievement. The restoration of a world that had seemed ready to tear itself apart. The Colosseum that Titus would complete and that Domitian would finish stands still in Rome, its ruins more visited than any building the ancient world produces in that. The practical dynasty that Vespasian founded lasted only 27 years, would end with Domitian's assassination and the Senate scramble to find a successor. But the restoration that Vespasian accomplished proved more durable than his bloodline, proved that the empire could survive crises that would have destroyed lesser systems, proved that competence could supply what charisma and heritage could not. Let the silence settle now over the ruins of the Forum of Peace that Vespasian built, over the amphitheater his dynasty gave Rome, over the memory of an emperor who proved that origins matter less than achievement, that the mule driver's grandson could save what the descendants of gods had nearly destroyed. The practical man had accomplished what the idealists could not. The man without pretensions had restored what pretension had endangered. And somewhere in the space between Vespasian's humble origins and his imperial achievements, a truth about Rome reveals itself. Her willingness to accept ability from any source when ability was what survival required. Her capacity to elevate the capable when the distinguished had proven otherwise. Trajan extended Rome's borders to their greatest reach, into Dacia's mountains where gold awaited, across Mesopotamia's ancient valleys to the Persian Gulf's shores, to territories so distant that maintaining them would prove impossible. The empire he inherited was prosperous and secure. The empire he left behind was glorious and overextended, magnificent and exhausted, victorious and somehow weakened by its victories. It is said that when Trajan stood at the Gulf's edge, watching Roman ships sail waters Alexander had sailed, he wept that age prevented him from following the Macedonians' path further into the unknown east. The ambition that this story reveals, the hunger for conquest that no achievement could satisfy, defined a reign that pushed Rome to limits that Trajan's successors would spend decades pulling back from. This is where our contemplation continues. With an emperor who embodied everything Roman virtue was supposed to be, whose reign was proclaimed the empire's height, whose achievements contained within themselves the seeds of troubles yet to come. 2. The deepening mystery whispers tell us of the wars that made Trajan's name immortal. The Dacian campaigns of 106 CE that conquered territories modern Romania remembers, that brought gold to Rome sufficient to finance decades of building and benefaction. The column that commemorates these victories still stands in Rome, its spiral frieze ascending like a stone scroll, telling in carved relief the story of conquest that Trajan's veterans had lived. The Dacian gold transformed Rome. The forum that Trajan built with its proceeds exceeded in magnificence anything previous emperors had managed. The basilica, the libraries, the column, the markets that cascaded down the hillside in tiers of commercial space. The message was clear. conquest paid, and paid magnificently, rewarded the empire with resources that peace alone could never have provided. The lesson was dangerous, encouraged successors to seek in war what Trajan had found, though the conquests that remained possible could not match Dacia's wealth. The eastern campaigns that concluded Trajan's reign pushed beyond what even Dacia's gold could justify. Into Armenia, into Mesopotamia, into territories that had defeated every Roman army previously sent against them. The capture of Ctesiphon, the Parthian capital, in 116 CE, announced that Trajan had accomplished what no Roman before him had managed, had reached into the heart of Rome's only rival and emerged triumphant. The provinces he created, Armenia, Mesopotamia, Assyria, extended Roman authority to boundaries that mapmakers had never imagined within the empire's scope. Yet even as the standards advanced, the fabric behind them was tearing. The Jewish communities throughout the East rose in revolt, while Trajan's armies pressed forward, massacred Roman citizens, and destroyed Roman settlements with fury that revealed how fragile imperial control remained in territories that conquest had not yet digested. The provinces Trajan created could not be held. The garrisons they required exceeded what the legions could spare while maintaining security elsewhere. The boundaries he drew in sand would wash away before his body reached Rome. The relationship with the Senate that made Trajan's reign golden in aristocratic memory rested on forms that flattered while they constrained. Trajan consulted, Trajan deferred. Trajan treated senators with respect that recalled republican ideals while exercising power that no republican had ever possessed. The result was cooperation that eased governance immeasurably. The smooth functioning of imperial administration that senatorial opposition had periodically disrupted under less tactful rulers. Some believe that Trajan's reign represented Rome's genuine apex, the moment when military power, administrative competence, and political harmony combined to produce greatness that neither precedent nor successor could match. The title Optimus that the Senate granted him, the best, was not flattery, but recognition. The acknowledgement that this emperor had achieved what emperors were supposed to achieve, had embodied the virtues that Rome was supposed to embody. Others see in the Eastern overreach the beginning of troubles that would multiply across subsequent decades. The demonstration that Rome had reached the limits of possible expansion, that further conquest would cost more than it returned, that the glory Trajan sought would become burden that Hadrian would have to shed. The boundaries Trajan drew marked both achievement and warning, both the furthest Rome would reach and the point beyond which reaching brought only exhaustion. 3. The fade into silence, and now, as the night deepens, we find ourselves at the base of Trajan's column, looking upward at the carved spiral that preserves his victories in stone. He died in 117 CE at Selinus in Cilicia, returning from the east where his conquests were already unraveling, leaving an empire that Hadrian would have to consolidate rather than expand. The adoption that made Hadrian his successor was announced only on Trajan's deathbed. Perhaps genuine, perhaps arranged by the Empress Plotina, whose influence over the dying emperor gave her power over the succession. The uncertainty itself suggests how personal imperial power remained, how dependent on individual relationships that death could sever without warning. The deification that followed was sincere. The Senate that had called him Optimus in life elevated him to divinity in death, placed his ashes beneath the column that told his story, granted him honors that marked him as among the greatest Rome had produced. The provinces he had created were abandoned almost immediately. Hadrian recognized what Trajan had refused to admit, that Rome could not hold what Rome had conquered. The boundaries that had seemed triumphant became lines of retreat, marks of overreach rather than achievement. Let the silence settle now over the forum that Trajan's gold had built, over the column that still spirals upward, telling stories of victories that could not be sustained, over the memory of an emperor who pushed Rome to its limits and thereby discovered what those limits were. The conqueror had found what conquest could not provide. The boundaries he drew in stone endured. Those he drew in sand did not. And somewhere in the space between Trajan's ambitions and Rome's capacities, a truth about empires reveals itself. Their tendency to expand beyond sustainability, their discovery of limits only through exceeding them, their achievement of greatness that contains within itself the seeds of its own diminishment. Hadrian traveled more than any emperor before or after, walked Britain's hills where he ordered his wall built, sailed the Nile where Antinous drowned, and grief transformed into deification, stood in Athens where he completed the temple to Olympian Zeus that had waited 6 centuries for its final columns. The emperor who chose consolidation over conquest found in movement what others sought in victory, understanding of what he ruled that staying in Rome could never have provided. It is said that he wished to see with his own eyes everything that he had learned from books, that the curiosity which drove him across the empire's length was intellectual as much as administrative, that he genuinely wanted to know what Rome had become, rather than merely command it. The journeys that consumed most of his reign were not inspection tours, but pilgrimages, not supervision, but wonder, not the emperor checking his possessions, but a soul seeking to comprehend the vastness it had somehow come to rule. This is where our contemplation continues, with an emperor who built walls rather than crossing them, who defined limits rather than exceeding them, who understood that Rome's survival required accepting what Rome's glory had always denied. 2. The deepening mystery whispers. Tell us of the wall that bears his name, 70 miles across Britain's narrowest point, separating the province Rome would hold from the territories Rome would not attempt to conquer. The wall was not merely military barrier but statement of identity, declaration that Rome ended here and what lay beyond was other, acknowledgement that expansion had found its boundary and that boundary would be maintained rather than overcome. The withdrawals that began Hadrian's reign marked reversal of everything Trajan had represented. The provinces his predecessor had created, Armenia, Mesopotamia, Syria, were abandoned within months of Hadrian's accession. their garrisons pulled back to defensible lines. Their briefly Roman populations left to whatever accommodations they could make, with powers that Rome had challenged and could not defeat. The reversal was strategically sound, but emotionally devastating, felt by many as betrayal of what Trajan soldiers had died to achieve. The journeys began in 121 CE and continued with interruptions until 132. Hadrian visited Gaul and Germany, Britain and Spain, Greece and Asia Minor, Syria and Egypt, North Africa, and almost every province the empire contained. He inspected fortifications, reviewed legions, examined administrative practices, and everywhere he went, he left monuments that proclaimed his presence, temples, buildings, entire cities that bore his name or reflected his taste. The love that defined and destroyed him came to Antinous, the beautiful Bithynian youth whose presence accompanied the emperor through the eastern journeys, whose drowning in the Nile in 130 CE produced grief that exceeded what any subject's death had ever evoked. The cities Hadrian founded in Antinous' honor, the temples he built for his worship, the constellation he named after him, all proclaimed a love that Roman propriety found excessive, that the emperor insisted on expressing regardless of what propriety required. The villa at Tivoli that Hadrian constructed during the years of his reign reproduced in miniature the places he had visited. An Egyptian canal, a Greek academy, a valley named for Tempe, buildings named for places the emperor had seen and wished to remember. The complex sprawled across acres of countryside, created private world where Hadrian could wander among memories of journeys completed, could touch reproductions of beauties he had witnessed across the empire's extent. The Jewish revolt of 132-136 CE revealed limits that even wall-building wisdom could not anticipate. Hadrian's decision to build a Roman colony on Jerusalem's ruins, to erect a temple to Jupiter where the Jewish temple had stood, provoked uprising that required 3 years and massive military resources to suppress. The destruction that followed, the expulsion of Jews from Jerusalem, the prohibition against even entering the city, the renaming of the province to erase Jewish memory, showed that the emperor who prized understanding had failed to understand that consolidation could provoke as much resistance as conquest. A thread, the fade into silence. And now, as contemplation grows quiet, we find ourselves in the villa at Tivoli, wandering among ruins that preserve fragments of an emperor's accumulated memories. Hadrian died in 138 CE at Baiae, after years of illness that had made death welcome, composing poetry about his soul as a little wandering thing, guest and companion of the body, about to descend to places pale and rigid and bare where it would no longer have its usual pleasures. The verses capture something essential about the man, his awareness of mortality that power could not prevent, his literary cultivation that distinguished him from military emperors who preceded and followed him, his sense that even absolute authority was temporary residence in a body that would fail. The deification that followed was contested. The Senate, that had often resented his absences and his preferences, hesitated to grant divine honors to an emperor who had executed senators and favored Greeks. the insistence of his successor Antoninus, who thereby earned the cognomen Pius for his filial devotion, secured the vote that placed Hadrian among the gods. The mausoleum he had built, which we call today the Castel Sant'Angelo, received his ashes and stands still beside the Tiber, transformed through centuries into fortress and prison and museum, but still marking where the wall builder rests. Let the silence settle now over Hadrian's wall as the northern wind blows, over Tivoli's ruins where his memories decayed into archaeology, over the poetry that preserves his voice more surely than any stone monument could. The emperor who walked among stars, who travelled so far, who loved so deeply, who built walls to define what Rome would be, found at the end what all emperors found, that power could not prevent the body's failure, that glory could not accompany the soul wherever the soul went, that even emperors must finally make the journey that Hadrian had described in verse, descending to colourless places where purple robes mean nothing. The wall builder had walked as far as walking could take him. The lover had lost what love could not keep. And somewhere in the space between Hadrian's travels and his final stillness, between the empire he consolidated and the body he could not preserve, a truth about limits reveals itself, their necessity, their wisdom, their ultimate inability to prevent the one limit that no wall can hold. Marcus Aurelius wrote philosophy by lamplight in military camps along the Danube, composing meditations on acceptance and duty while barbarian armies gathered in darkness beyond the Roman firelight. The Stoic sage, who had studied wisdom since boyhood, found himself spending most of his reign in places wisdom had always fled. On campaign, in trenches, surrounded by death he had learned to accept but could not prevent. It is said that he never sought the purple, that Hadrian had noticed him as a youth and begun the process that led to his eventual succession, that the years of preparation had been someone else's plan rather than his ambition. The philosopher king whom Plato had imagined centuries earlier found unexpected embodiment in this reluctant emperor, who wanted only to read and think, but was forced instead to fight and command. This is where our contemplation continues, with an emperor who tested whether wisdom could survive contact with power, whether philosophy could guide a soul through demands that philosophy had always counselled avoiding. 2. The deepening mystery. Whispers tell us of the education that shaped him, the tutors in rhetoric and philosophy, the Stoic teachers who taught him that virtue was the only good, that external circumstances were indifferent, that the wise man accepted what he could not change while working to change what virtue required. The young Marcus absorbed these lessons so thoroughly that they became not mere beliefs, but the structure of his consciousness, the framework through which he understood everything that happened to him. The reign began well enough. Co-emperorship with Lucius Verus, partnership that divided responsibilities and seemed to promise the leisure for philosophy that Marcus craved. But the Parthian War demanded Verus's presence in the east, and the plague that the returning armies brought back devastated the empire with thoroughness that no military defeat had managed. The pestilence killed millions, emptied cities, disrupted the tax revenues and the trade networks on which Roman prosperity depended. The Marcomannic Wars that consumed most of his reign began in the plague's wake. Germanic peoples pressing against frontiers that depleted legions could no longer adequately defend. Marcus spent year after year on the Danube, fighting enemies who could be defeated but not eliminated, who retreated and returned, who seemed to multiply regardless of how many Roman victories the dispatches reported. The philosopher found himself general. The man who wanted to think found himself forced to act. The soul that sought tranquility found itself surrounded by everything tranquility required escaping. The meditations that he wrote during these campaigns were never meant for publication, were private notes to himself, reminders of what philosophy taught, attempts to maintain wisdom's perspective when circumstances offered every reason to abandon it. The emperor who commanded legions wrote about accepting what he could not change. The man who determined life and death wrote about the insignificance of power. The ruler who might have believed himself exceptional wrote constantly about his own mortality, his own insignificance, his own inability to control anything except his own responses. Some believe that the meditations revealed tension that could not be resolved. The contradiction between Stoic acceptance and imperial responsibility, between the philosophy that counseled withdrawal and the duty that demanded engagement. Marcus struggled throughout his journals with the competing demands of contemplative ideals and active obligations, never quite reconciling them, never quite abandoning either, holding both in creative tension that produced some of antiquity's most enduring philosophy. The persecutions that occurred during his reign, Christians executed in Lyon and elsewhere, complicate the image of the philosopher king dispensing wisdom. Marcus saw in Christianity not alternative wisdom, but dangerous superstition, stubbornness that disrupted civic harmony, refusal to perform the religious duties that Roman tradition required. The Stoic universalism that modern readers admire in his writings did not extend to protecting those whose beliefs he found irrational and destructive. The succession that he arranged proved his greatest failure. Commodus, his son, showed none of the philosophical temperament that adoption might have selected for, was interested in gladiatorial combat rather than governance, in pleasure rather than duty, in self-indulgence rather than the self-restraint that Marcus had embodied. The philosopher who had written so much about accepting what could not be changed could not change his own son, could not prevent the disaster that Commodus would become. 3. The fade into silence. And now, as the night deepens and contemplation grows quiet, we find ourselves in the camp on the Danube, where Marcus wrote his final meditations. He died in 180 CE at Vindobona, modern Vienna, still on campaign, still fighting the wars that had consumed his reign, still far from the Rome he had ruled without often seeing. The soldiers who had served him mourned genuinely. The Senate that received news of his death recognized that something irreplaceable had passed. The philosopher king would not come again. The combination of wisdom and power that Marcus represented was too rare to expect its repetition. The deification that followed was uncontested. The Senate that had honored him in life honored him more in death, recognized that this emperor at least had earned the divine status that custom granted. The column that Commodus completed in his honor still stands in Rome, its spiral relief telling the story of the Danubian Wars, much as Trajan's column had told of Dacian conquests. But where Trajan's monument celebrated victory, Marcus's commemorated endurance, the determination to continue when victory itself proved impossible. Let the silence settle now over the pages of the meditations that somehow survived, over the camps where they were written, over the memory of an emperor who proved that philosophy could survive power even if it could not guide it perfectly. The tent and trench had not destroyed the philosopher. The demands of empire had not silenced the voice that spoke of acceptance and duty, and the insignificance of everything except virtue. The philosopher had ruled as best philosophy permitted. The emperor had philosophized as best emperorship allowed. And somewhere in the space between Marcus's ideals and his circumstances, between what the meditations counseled and what the campaigns required, a truth about wisdom reveals itself, its capacity to survive what it cannot control, its persistence through conditions that should have silenced it, its ability to speak across centuries to anyone who has felt the gap between what we seek and what we find. Diocletian understood what a century of crisis had demonstrated, that the empire had grown too vast for one man to defend, too complex for one court to govern, too threatened on too many frontiers for any single response to suffice. The solution he devised was radical beyond anything previous reforms had attempted. He divided the Roman world into portions, created multiple emperors where one had always ruled, constructed system where personality had always dominated. It is said that he rose from obscurity so complete that even his origin remained disputed. Perhaps Dalmatian, perhaps the son of a freedman, perhaps someone whose ancestors had been slaves before earning the freedom that made his ascent possible. The uncertainty itself is significant. This was an emperor who needed no distinguished lineage, because he would create distinction through achievement, who sought legitimacy through success rather than inheritance. This is where our contemplation continues, with an emperor who saved Rome by transforming her beyond recognition, who preserved the empire by dividing it, who understood that survival sometimes requires becoming something so different that the thing surrounded is no longer quite itself. 2. The deepening mysteries whispers tell us of the 50 years that preceded his reign, the crisis of the 3rd century, when emperors rose and fell with terrifying rapidity, when portions of the empire broke away entirely, when plague and invasions seemed to promise the end of everything Rome had built. 26 emperors in 50 years, most dying violently, none lasting long enough to establish stability. This was the world Diocletian inherited when the purple fell to him in 284 CE. The tetrarchy that he created placed 4 rulers where one had failed. 2 senior emperors bearing the title Augustus, 2 junior emperors bearing the title Caesar, each responsible for a portion of the empire, each defending frontiers that no single ruler could have covered. The system divided not merely authority, but presence. placed imperial courts in Nicomedia and Milan, in Sirmium and Trier, cities closer to the threatened borders than Rome herself had ever been. The administrative reorganization that accompanied the Tetrarchy restructured provinces that had remained largely unchanged since Augustus, divided them into smaller units, placed them under new hierarchies, created layers of supervision that earlier emperors had never imagined. The bureaucracy multiplied, the regulation intensified, the state's reach extended into aspects of life that Roman liberty had previously protected from imperial attention. The sacred symbolism that Diocletian cultivated transformed how emperors related to their subjects. No longer princeps, first citizen among equals, but dominus et deus, Lord and God, requiring prostration from those who approached, hidden behind curtains and ceremonies that separated the imperial presence from all ordinary humanity. The accessibility that earlier emperors had at least pretended to offer disappeared behind rituals borrowed from Eastern courts that Rome had always scorned. The persecution of Christians that culminated in the Great Persecution of 303 CE represented Diocletian's attempt to enforce the religious unity that he believed political unity required. The churches that had grown throughout the 3rd century's chaos seemed to threaten the traditional pieties on which Roman order depended. Diocletian demanded their destruction with thoroughness that exceeded what any previous persecution had attempted. The failure of this persecution, the inability of imperial power to eliminate a faith that had grown too deeply rooted, would prove as significant as any administrative reform. Some believe that Diocletian's reforms saved what remained of Roman civilization, that without the restructuring he imposed, the empire would have fragmented entirely, would have dissolved into the regional powers that the 3rd century breakaways had foreshadowed. The Eastern Empire that survived for another millennium owed its existence to patterns Diocletian had established. The Western recovery that permitted another century of Roman rule would not have been possible without the foundations he had laid. Others see in his transformations the death of what Rome had been, the replacement of citizen with subject, of accessibility with distance, of the republican traditions that emperors had always at least honored with something frankly oriental and despotic. The Rome that emerged from Diocletian's reforms was Rome in name, but not in character. Preserved in form, but altered in substance beyond what earlier generations would have recognized. 3. The fade into silence. And now, as contemplation grows quiet, we find ourselves at Split. On the Dalmatian coast, where Diocletian built the palace for his unprecedented retirement. He abdicated in 305 CE, the only Roman emperor ever to voluntarily surrender power, and withdrew to the palace, whose walls still define the Croatian city that has grown within them. The gardens where he grew cabbages became famous. The response he gave when urged to return to power, more famous still. "Come and see the cabbages I have planted," he supposedly said, "and then tell me whether I should exchange this peace for the storms of renewed ambition." The system he created fell apart almost immediately after his departure. The Tetrarchy dissolving into civil wars, as the Caesars and Augusti contested for dominance that the system was supposed to have made unnecessary. Constantine would emerge from these struggles to rule alone, would abandon the divided authority that Diocletian had believed essential, would prove that one man could still hold what four had been created to share. Yet something of Diocletian's vision persisted through the empire's remaining centuries. The administrative structures, the ceremonial distance, the sense that the emperor was something more than merely powerful human being, all continued through the transformations that followed, shaped how Byzantium would understand imperial authority long after the Western Empire had ceased to exist. Let the silence settle now over the palace at Split, over the mausoleum that was converted to a church, over the walls that have sheltered inhabitants for 17 centuries, since the emperor who built them chose retirement over power's continuation. The emperor who split the world had saved what splitting could save. The man who created the tetrarchy had proven that some solutions work only in the hands that design them. And somewhere in the space between Diocletian's innovations and their aftermath, a truth about reform reveals itself. Its dependence on circumstances that cannot be replicated. Its inability to outlast the genius that conceived it. Its tendency to produce consequences that its creators never imagined. Constantine saw something in the sky before battle. A cross of light. Words promising victory. A vision that would transform an empire from persecutor to patron of the faith it had tried to destroy. Whatever he actually witnessed on that autumn afternoon in 312 CE, whether divine revelation or tactical inspiration, genuine mystical experience or useful fiction, the consequences reshaped Western civilization more thoroughly than any military victory could have managed. It is said that he commanded his soldiers to mark their shields with Christ's symbol before engaging the usurper Maxentius, that the battle at the Milvian Bridge became not merely political contest, but religious test. That victory vindicated the vision and obligated the victor. The cross that had been mark of criminal execution became suddenly sign of imperial favor, and the faith that emperors had persecuted became suddenly faith that emperors would promote. This is where our contemplation continues, with an emperor who redirected the religious course of history, whose conversion, whatever motivated it, created the Christian world that subsequent centuries would inhabit. 2. The deepening mystery. Whispers tell us of the path that brought Constantine to that bridge. The civil wars that followed Diocletian's abdication. The struggle among tetrarchs and their sons for dominance that the system had been designed to prevent. Constantine's father, Constantius, had been Caesar and then Augustus in the West. Constantine himself had been passed over in Diocletian's succession arrangements, had been present in Galerius's court as something between guest and hostage, had escaped to join his father in Britain just before Constantius died. The vision itself remains shrouded in the uncertainties that surround all religious experience. Some sources say he saw the cross in the sky, with the words, "In this sign conquer." Others say the revelation came in a dream the night before battle. Still others suggest that his conversion developed gradually over years, rather than occurring in a single transformative moment. What is certain is that after the Milvian Bridge, Constantine favored Christianity with consistency that transformed the faith situation across the empire. The Edict of Milan in 313 CE established tolerance for all religions, ended the persecutions that Diocletian had intensified, restored to Christians the property that persecution had confiscated. But tolerance was only the beginning. What followed was favor that transformed Christianity from permitted faith to privileged one. The churches Constantine built, St. Peter's in Rome, the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, the Hagia Sophia's predecessor in Constantinople, proclaimed in architecture what his policies proclaimed in law. That this emperor served Christ as earlier emperors had served Jupiter. The Council of Nicaea in 325 CE demonstrated how thoroughly Constantine intended to shape the faith he had adopted. The theological disputes that divided Christians, the nature of Christ's divinity, the relationship between Father and Son, were not merely spiritual matters, but threats to the unity that Constantine sought. He summoned the bishops to his palace, presided over their deliberations, insisted on the creed that would define orthodoxy for centuries to come. The emperor, who could not entirely explain the theology he was enforcing, nonetheless enforced it with authority that no theologian possessed. Constantinople's foundation announced that a new Rome was rising, a city built Christian from its foundations, untainted by the pagan temples and traditions that marked the old capital, designed to be capital of a transformed empire that would serve the god Constantine had seen in vision. The city that would bear his name for 16 centuries began a statement of faith as much as administrative convenience, as monument to conversion as much as to strategic calculation. The mysteries that surround his faith have never been resolved. He was baptized only on his deathbed, not unusual for an era when baptism was believed to wash away all sins and was therefore better delayed until sinning had concluded. He continued to honor Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, whose cult had been popular among emperors before him, and whose symbolism blurred with Christian imagery in ways that might have been deliberate syncretism or merely transitional confusion. The question of whether his conversion was spiritually genuine or politically calculated has occupied historians for centuries without producing consensus. Some believe that Constantine's sincerity matters less than his consequences, that whatever he actually believed, the world he created was genuinely Christian in ways that transformed everything from law to art, to philosophy to daily life. The empire that emerged from his reign was not the empire that entered it. The God that emperors would serve for the next 1,000 years was not the God that emperors had served for the previous 1,000. Thread. The fade into silence. And now, as the night deepens, we find ourselves in the church of the Holy Apostles that Constantine built for his own burial. The church where his sarcophagus stood, surrounded by cenotaphs to the 12 disciples, where he claimed for himself the 13th position, apostle to emperors as Peter had been apostle to Rome. He died in 337 C at Nicomedia, receiving baptism at last as death approached, leaving an empire that his sons would fight over, and a faith that his patronage had transformed. The deification that earlier emperors had received was inappropriate for a Christian ruler. Constantine instead was venerated as saint by the Eastern Church, remembered as equal to the apostles for the work of conversion that his reign had accomplished. The transformation he initiated continued long after his death. The temples gradually closing, the sacrifices gradually ceasing, the old gods gradually fading from public life as the new god claimed what they had held. The process took generations to complete, faced resistance that Julian would briefly embody, encountered persistence among rural populations that gave paganism its name, paganus meaning country dweller. But the direction Constantine had established proved irreversible. The vision at the Milvian Bridge had changed what Rome would be forever. Let the silence settle now over the ruins of the old St. Peter's that Constantine built, over Constantinople that still bears his name as Istanbul, over the faith that his patronage transformed from persecuted sect to imperial religion. The vision had found its vessel. The convert had converted an empire. And somewhere in the space between what Constantine saw and what Constantine did, between his private faith and its public consequences, a truth about history reveals itself. How much can turn on a single moment? How much can change through a single person? How much the world we inherit depends on choices we did not make and visions we did not share. Julian attempted to turn back time, to restore the old gods, to reopen the temples Constantine's successors had closed, to prove that Rome's ancient covenant with Jupiter and Mars and all the deities who had protected her for 1,000 years could still be renewed. His reign lasted barely 2 years. His restoration died with him. His failure proved as consequential as any success could have been. It is said that he had been raised Christian by necessity. The imperial family's murders following Constantine's death had left him orphaned and supervised by eunuchs and bishops, who ensured that he received proper Christian education. But somewhere in those constrained years, Julian had discovered the philosophers, had found in their teachings the old wisdom that Christianity claimed to have superseded, had converted secretly to the gods his public life required him to deny. This is where our contemplation continues, with an emperor who attempted what could not be accomplished, whose brief reign illuminated by its failure how complete the transformation Constantine had initiated had become. 2. The deepening mystery whispers tell us of the years of concealment. Julian studying philosophy under teachers who still honored the old ways, performing the Christian rituals his position required, while his heart yearned for temples that stood empty, for sacrifices that no longer rose, for gods whose silence seemed to him abandonment rather than defeat. The letters he wrote to fellow believers in the old ways had to be coded, cautious, deniable. The faith he held was dangerous in a Christian empire that tolerated dissent poorly. The elevation to Caesar in 355 CE placed Julian in Gaul, commanding armies against Germanic invaders, demonstrating military capability that his cloistered youth had not led anyone to expect. The victories he achieved made him popular with soldiers who were not yet entirely Christian, who remembered the old traditions, who found in Julian's philosophical demeanour something that reminded them of Marcus Aurelius, rather than the Christian emperors they had known. The proclamation as Augustus in 360 CE forced Julian into civil war against Constantius II, his cousin, the last surviving son of Constantine. The conflict resolved itself through Constantius's death before battle could be joined. Julian entered Constantinople in 361 as sole emperor, finally able to reveal what he had hidden throughout his life. The restoration began immediately. The temple that had been closed were ordered reopened. The sacrifices that had ceased were ordered resumed. The priests who had been dispersed were summoned back to duties that Christian supremacy had interrupted. Julian himself sacrificed ostentatiously, publicly, frequently, demonstrated by personal example what he wished his empire to return to, what he believed Rome required for her survival and prosperity. The attempt to construct a pagan church, an organized structure that could compete with Christianity's bishops and hierarchies, with charitable institutions and theological schools, revealed how thoroughly Christianity had transformed what religion meant. The old paganism had never needed organization. The gods had been honored through civic ritual rather than individual salvation, through sacrifice rather than doctrine, through tradition rather than institution. Julian's efforts to create what paganism had never possessed demonstrated that he was fighting Christianity on Christianity's terms, that even in resistance he had absorbed what he was resisting. The letter against the Galileans that Julian composed attacked Christianity with philosophical arguments that revealed both his learning and his limitations, his inability to understand why the faith he despised appealed so widely, his blindness to the needs that Christianity satisfied and that his philosophical paganism could not address. The masses who had converted, who found in Christ something the philosophers could not provide, were unmoved by arguments that assumed they had chosen wrongly what they had chosen, for reasons argument could not reach. The fade into silence. And now, as contemplation grows quiet, we find ourselves on the Persian frontier, where Julian's restoration ended with a spear wound in a night skirmish, ended with an emperor's death far from the temples he had tried to revive. He died in 363 CE, barely 31 years old, having reigned less than 2 years, leaving behind an attempt at restoration that his successors immediately abandoned. The words attributed to his dying breath, "You have conquered, Galilean," are probably fiction, but they capture something true about what his death meant. The last serious attempt to reverse Christianity's triumph had failed, and the failure was final. The temples closed again within months. The sacrifices ceased again. The priests who had emerged from hiding returned to hiding or accepted the new reality that Julian's death had confirmed. The empire would be Christian henceforth. The old gods would fade into mythology, would become literature rather than faith, would survive only in the forms that Christianity allowed them, as planets, as days of the week, as stories that no longer commanded belief. Let the silence settle now over the abandoned temples Julian had tried to restore, over the philosophical schools that had taught him the old ways, over the battlefield in Persia where his restoration ended before it could truly begin. The last pagan had believed he could reverse what Constantine had accomplished. His failure proved how complete the transformation had been. Not merely political, but spiritual. Not merely imperial, but civilizational. And somewhere in the space between Julian's vision and his death, between what he attempted and what he could not achieve, a truth about religious change reveals itself. Its irreversibility, once it has passed certain thresholds. Its indifference to the convictions of those who would oppose it. Its capacity to transform so completely that restoration becomes literally unimaginable to those who live within the transformed world. Justinian ruled from Constantinople when Rome herself had fallen, when the Western Empire had fragmented into kingdoms ruled by peoples Rome had once called barbarian. Yet he dreamed of restoration, believed that what had been lost could be recovered, that the Roman world could be reunited under his authority, that heaven itself could be built upon earth in churches whose domes would seem to float unsupported above congregations that gazed upward in wonder. It is said that when he entered the completed Hagia Sophia for the first time, he paused in amazement at what his architects had achieved, then spoke words that compared himself to Solomon. "I have surpassed you." The pride was perhaps excessive. The achievement that prompted it was not. The church he built remains, transformed into mosque and then museum, and now mosque again, still astonishing visitors who stand beneath its dome 15 centuries after Justinian's engineers solved problems they should not have been able to solve. This is where our contemplation concludes, with an emperor who reached for everything and achieved more than anyone except himself believed sufficient, whose reign was Rome's last great flourishing, and perhaps her most magnificent refusal to accept that autumn had become winter. 2. The deepening mystery. Whispers tell us of the Nika riots that nearly ended his reign before it properly began, the factions that united against him, the fires that destroyed much of Constantinople, the moment when Justinian prepared to flee until Theodora, his empress, his actress, his partner in everything, declared that she would rather die in purple than live in exile. The decision to stay, to fight, to massacre the rioters in the Hippodrome by the tens of thousands, secured his throne and demonstrated the steel beneath the imperial silk. Theodora herself remains figure of fascination across the centuries. The dancer, the courtesan, the woman whose early life violated every standard of imperial dignity, who nonetheless became empress and proved herself Justinian's equal in intelligence, in determination, in the capacity for ruthlessness that rule required. The laws he changed to permit their marriage, the restrictions he removed that had forbidden senators from marrying actresses, demonstrated that this emperor would reshape law itself when law obstructed what he sought. The codification of Roman law that Justinian ordered became perhaps his most enduring achievement. The gathering of centuries of legal development into coherent code. The corpus juris civilis that would influence European law for a millennium after the empire that produced it had vanished. The The jurists who accomplished this work under his direction understood that they were preserving not merely rules, but civilization. That law was what made Rome Roman in ways that territory could not. The reconquest that Justinian's generals accomplished pushed the empire's borders westward again. North Africa recovered from the Vandals, Italy recovered from the Ostrogoths, portions of Spain recovered from the Visigoths. The Mediterranean became again what Augustus had made it, a Roman lake, surrounded by Roman territories, secured by Roman fleets. The empire that had seemed doomed to permanent division was reunited, at least in part, at least for a time. Yet the costs of these achievements proved devastating. The wars in Italy lasted decades, left the peninsula more devastated than the barbarian invasions had ever managed, made the recovery Justinian sought more destructive than the loss it was meant to reverse. The plague that struck in 541 CE killed perhaps half the empire's population, created labor shortages that undermined everything, began the demographic collapse that would continue for generations. The eastern frontiers that Justinian neglected while pursuing Western dreams grew vulnerable to Persian pressure that his successors would struggle to contain. The churches Justinian built, Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, San Vitale in Ravenna, countless others across his domains, proclaimed confidence that his reign's disasters seemed to contradict. The mosaics that preserve his image and Theodora's, the domes that proclaimed imperial piety, the spaces that lifted worshippers' eyes toward heaven, all asserted that this emperor was building something permanent, something that would outlast the troubles that beset his reign, something that would continue long after he himself had passed. Threed. The fade into silence. And now, as the night reaches its deepest hour and our chronicle nears its end, we stand beneath the dome of Hagia Sophia, watching light filter through windows that Justinian's architects placed to make the dome seem to float on radiance itself. He died in 565 CE, having reigned for 38 years, having accomplished more than any single emperor since Augustus, and yet having left an empire weaker than he found it. The reconquests began unraveling almost immediately. Italy lost again within a few years, North Africa following in the 7th century, the Mediterranean returning to division that would prove permanent. The restoration that had seemed achieved proved temporary. The Roman world that Justinian reunited separated again and would never be reunited by Roman power. Yet something survived that the political failures could not undo. The law code that his jurists compiled would shape how Europe understood justice for centuries after the empire had vanished. The churches that his architects built would inspire builders for a millennium. The idea of Rome that his reign embodied, the conviction that civilization meant something, that it was worth preserving, that heaven itself might be built on earth through human effort directed by divine grace. This persisted through all the losses that followed. Let the silence settle now over Hagia Sophia's ancient stones, over the mosaics that preserve Justinian's face, over the empire he tried to restore and could not quite hold. The emperor who built heaven upon earth had discovered what all builders discover, that building is easier than maintaining. that creation is simpler than preservation, that even the greatest achievements require successors capable of sustaining what the founders established. The dome still floats above those who enter, still seems to hang unsupported, still catches light in ways that make the physical seem spiritual. Justinian built what he could build, reached for what he could reach, refused to accept that Rome's time had passed. His refusal bought another millennium for the Eastern Empire, preserved what could be preserved, demonstrated that endings are not always as final as they seem. And somewhere in the space between what Justinian achieved and what he could not sustain, between the glory of Hagia Sophia and the loss of Italy, a truth about empires reveals itself, their capacity to flourish even in decline, their ability to create beauty even in diminishment, their persistence in memory long after their persistence in power has ended. The chronicle closes as all chronicles must, not with ending, but with recognition that endings are illusions, that the emperors we have traced continue in ways our contemplation has perhaps begun to comprehend. Their laws still shape how we think about justice. Their roads still carry travelers across landscapes they ordered transformed. Their language persists in the vocabulary we use without knowing its origins. Their monuments still stand where they ordered them placed, weathered by centuries, yet still proclaiming what Roman power achieved. We have walked through 5 centuries of imperial history, have followed the purple from Augustus's careful accumulation to Justinian's desperate restoration. Each emperor we examined faced the same fundamental challenge: how to wield power that exceeded what any human should possess, how to govern territories too vast for any mind to comprehend, how to make decisions whose consequences would outlast any life, including their own. The fire that burned in Roman hearts, the conviction that their civilization was worth preserving, that their values were worth spreading, that their achievements merited the costs they imposed. This fire has never entirely been extinguished. We who inherit their world carry their expectations about what governments should provide, what laws should protect, what power should accomplish. The very concept of empire that they perfected shapes how we think about large-scale political organization, even when we believe ourselves opposed to what empire meant. What have we learned from this meditation on Rome's emperors? Perhaps only this, that power transforms those who wield it in ways they cannot anticipate, that even the wisest find wisdom insufficient for the challenges that rule imposes, that the greatest achievements contain within themselves the conditions of their own undoing. Augustus created a system that survived his death but could not survive mediocre successors indefinitely. Trajan extended borders that his successors could not maintain. Marcus Aurelius philosophized about acceptance while fighting wars he could not end. Diocletian divided the empire to save it, only to watch his divisions become permanent. Constantine converted an empire and changed the course of civilization, but could not ensure that his descendants would be worthy of what he had built. Perhaps we have also learned that persistence is possible even when circumstances counsel despair, that empires can survive crises that should destroy them, that civilization can endure catastrophes that should erase it, that the human capacity for continuation exceeds what reasonable calculation would predict. The emperors we have traced face plagues and invasions, civil wars and assassinations, challenges that should have ended everything and somehow ended nothing essential. The empire they ruled outlasted them all, outlasted the dynasty of Augustus and the restoration of Vespasian and the philosophy of Marcus Aurelius, endured in the East for 1,000 years beyond what we usually call Rome's fall. As sleep approaches, as the mind grows quiet, we release these contemplations to whatever processing the unconscious performs while waking thought rests. The emperors have been witnessed, the pattern of power has been traced. The recognition of what Rome was and what she became has been achieved, or approached as closely as such achievement permits. The laurel wreath that emperors wore has long since crumbled, but the idea of what that wreath represented, achievement, authority, the recognition that some rise above the common measure, persists in every award, every honor, every acknowledgement that excellence exists and deserves celebration. The purple that emperors wore has faded from all the robes that once carried it, but the association of that color with power persists in ecclesiastical vestments and royal traditions that have forgotten their origin while preserving their meaning. Rest now. The chronicle is complete for tonight, though the story itself continues. The emperors we have traced are history, are completed reigns whose outcomes we know. We have witnessed them safely, have learned from them what they had to teach, have carried their lessons to the threshold of sleep. The empire persists in all that we have inherited from it. The emperors persist in all that we remember of them as the power they wielded has passed, but the forms through which they wielded it have shaped forms we still employ. And somewhere in the silence between their world and ours, between the marble halls where they ruled and the quiet rooms where we contemplate them, the meaning of Rome continues to unfold. Still relevant, still instructive, still capable of teaching those who approach with patience enough to learn what power was and what power costs. Sleep well. The ancient eagles keep their vigil, and when you wake, the world will be there still, shaped by hands that have been dust for millennia, yet still present in everything they built, and everything they destroyed, and everything they dreamed.